Hello, this presentation is about Teesworks dredging of the River Tees. Now, specifically, this was a capital dredge as part of the development of the South Bank Quay. What I'd like to tell you about is what happened with that. So here we have a map of the River Tees here, and the area in purple is the area that was being dredged as to create a berth pocket and access to the larger channel as part of the development of the South Bank Quay. So South Bank Quay is along here, and all these little red dots, markers, show where various samples were taken. So these are on land samples taken from the land that was later dumped at sea. And these are samples that were taken in the channel, areas where they were taken. Now, the area in red here was so contaminated that it could not be disposed of at sea. The Marine Management Organisation specified the licence that approved this dredging operation that the closed bucket should be used, specifically to avoid contamination of the River Tees. Now, sadly, that bucket really wasn't very closed because when the river was tested afterwards, what they found was considerable contamination, both in the area that had been dredged around the area and out into the channel. Now, they then remediated that, so they then went back and removed material from this, did scrapes to remove material to actually clean up where they'd found contamination. But even after that, the river bed was more contaminated than before the dredge. So what these tables at the bottom here show is that for cadmium, for example, in the position SS004, so here, there was 64% more cadmium on the riverbed than there had been before. So material from this highly contaminated area here had actually just spread across the whole river. The bucket hadn't been closed. Now, the rest of the river was being maintenance dredged, so they didn't actually measure what contamination happened there, or at least they haven't reported that as part of the documents I've looked at, and which is a part of the documents submitted as part of the Marine Management Organisation's marine licence document. So, in the case of some of these other materials, so these are now pesticides and nasty organochlorine materials, there was, almost 1,000% more material of some of these actually in these sites than there was before. Some areas had been reduced. I mean, in the case of this, arsenic had gone down by 1%. I mean, I wouldn't take those as being absolute, but that's based on the measurements. Some of these other materials have gone down by 90%, so there's only 10% left. But others, gone up by 1,000%. So basically, there's clean dredging because the bucket obviously wasn't closed when actually contaminated the riverbed. Now, we know about what happened in these areas that were then post-sampled, and they were cleaned up to some extent. But as we said, they're now still dirty. But this material presumably spread into the rest of the river and will have been carried out to sea, and will have also been picked up by maintenance dredging that will have then been carried out as part of the keeping the channel open. So what happens? Why was this decided not to dispose of this material at sea? This all depends on what are called CFAS. So the government's marine laboratory, CFAS, has a set of action levels, and they're used by the marine management as part of a weight of evidence-based approach to decide how suitable material is to dredge at sea. And these action levels are not statutory, but they are contaminant concentration dredge materials, and they're not pass-fail, but they are triggers for further assessment to happen. So what are these levels? For most materials, there is an action level 1, which means basically anything above this has to look into the effect will actually dispose of this material, and we'll see what will happen. And anything with an action level 2, if you are beyond 800 milligrams of zinc per kilogram of dry sediment, then you cannot dump that material at sea. As you can see, for these organotins, it's 1 part per million. Now, a lot of the materials we're interested in, because of the nature of the Teesworks site, are PAHs, so polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These will basically have come out of the coal tar process that was part of making coke. So when coke is made, you get coal tar as a byproduct, and that byproduct is full of these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. But there is no action level 2. And the action levels for the different pHs vary to a certain amount because there are lots of chemicals involved in this. So, as I said, basically above level 2, it's considered unsuitable for the sea disposal, unless the MMO decides for some other reasons why you should allow it. Below action level 1, then it's no concern. So it doesn't actually have an influence on license decision. And between action levels 1 and 2, you require further consideration. So as you can see, if it's just above action level 1, you might expect there isn't really anything to worry about. However, what we actually see is often things are many times above action level 1. So what we've done is gone back and looked at the sampling data. So Richard Randall did a lot of this work. He went and looked at the sampling data that was available as part of the marine applications that told us what the levels at different depths within the boreholes taken into the river were. So as you can see on this picture here, we have borehole 34, which was the most contaminated. And with that area, there are, for this particular naphthalene, it was 30 times more than the action level 1. Now, actually, that was the same for boreholes 33 and boreholes 32. But borehole 34 was excluded because other materials in there are also at high concentration. However, boreholes 30 for area material from boreholes 33 and 32 are allowed to go to sea, despite having these very high levels of naphthalene. And the same is true when you look at what could be phase 2 of the South Bank Quay, which will be along here, where boreholes 31 and 30 have very high levels of naphthalene again. And as you can see, there are other points out in the river. So this point here, once again, has 30 times, over 30 times the action level 1 for naphthalene. Sorry, wrong slide. And then these other points here are only 6 to 15 times higher. Another point here that's 16 to 30 times higher. So as you can see, the contamination is fairly widely spread across the river. Now, this isn't surprising because there's been industry going on for over 100 years here. And once you get below the sediment, so the sediment, the very recent sediment, which is possibly washed in sand or peat that's come down the river from the wash away of the peat on the moors and sediments on the bottom of here, you will get down to historic sediment or historic contamination. And that's what worries us about any operation where you start digging up this material, and why the MMO specifically said that for this excluded area, it should use a closed bucket to ensure that none of this highly contaminated material ended up in the general river. Sadly, as the previous slide showed, that wasn't the case. Now, if you have a look at other chemicals, you actually see that once again there are huge levels of contamination. So rather than go for the ones that were just the most, just for that one component. So here we were looking at naphthalene, and now on this side we're picking out all the elements. So for example, for these positions here, it was between 16 and 30 times action level 1 for pyrene. For this position here, as we said before, there was over 30 times, there was 16 to 30 times the naphthalene concentration. And, same here, we've got materials that are, ridiculously, here we have something where there's about 5 times the nickel level that's allowed to be, well, it counts as action level 1. And then we have other hydrocarbons showing up, and copper, for example, showing up at between 2 and 5 times action level 1. So right across this area, there is considerable levels of contamination. So that was really all I want to say about the dredging, that, if you dig up contaminated material, it is likely to spread across the river. Once it spreads into the river, it will be in the sediment, and we don't know what happens to then. It will be dredged by the normal dredging processes. So out here, you've got normal dredging happening, as will be the case for this part of the river. Once the quay is built, as it is now, this material will be taken out and dumped at sea. If that contains contaminants, they will go into the rest of the water system, or they will stay in the sediment. As the sediment is washed away from the dump areas, they could then result in contamination further down the coast. Thank you for listening. This is a complicated situation, and there are lots of contaminants. It would be lovely to have a map of the River Tees to understand which are the most contaminated bits, but all we have is the various bits of sampling that have been done as part of planning applications. Thank you for listening.